What is semantic drift? It's when one word starts to mean something different, usually more specific, like how drag came to mean specifically to drag an implement across a surface to create a picture. Without it, English vocabulary would be identical to Proto-Indo-European. What would it look like nowadays? We're using Donald Ringa's Swadesh list, which is the most complete and also the most friendly to Proto-Germanic. Today we're doing nouns. Maybe we'll move on to verbs next week. Verbs are more complicated and unpredictable. Once again, we're doing it in alphabetical order of the German translations. So we start with ash. Ash is mostly friendly to the PIE origin. This is believed to be something like has, with a feminine ending involving a velar. In theory, this is zero grade with a Slavic laryngeal making a short vowel, and Proto-Germanic asko is the result. But it is very easy to disrupt this delicate balance. If it's O grade, we end up with osko. If it's unstressed, we end up with argo. In theory, that would be oosh and arrow, but I feel like it would shorten to osh. Okay, but that doesn't count. Ash is alright. Fix something that doesn't work, like I. I was diphthongized in Proto-Germanic to match ear, which led to a bunch of complications down the line. If we end up sticking with a short A, we'll get aw the same way we got ma. However, if the final vowel ends up as an E, like it did with the actual word I, the first vowel would be fronted and end up as A. The PIE word for the belly is cognate with uterus in Latin. Strangely, this is completely unrelated to udder in English. On the other hand, it is very related to both definitions of udder and also outer. I think udder makes the most sense, heck, maybe even by analogy to udder. These words are pronounced the same in my accent. So, over to tree. This is again from Proto-Indo-European. Technically, this is from the lexeme doru, but it's from the oblique stem, not nominative, where the stress and therefore the vowel is here, so dreu. Kind of a big difference. Now, Proto-Germanic tends to be very picky about how a word can end, and if you don't fit, they like to lump you all together in the an stems. So named because they end in an extra long O. That means we would really be learning doro, which is taro in Proto-Germanic. Now, I don't really want to stress too much about the ending because it almost certainly drops off in the journey to Old English, especially considering doro by analogy, which became tear in modern English, especially considering the semantic similarities. I have tear for tree. Mountain is kind of a gimme. I mean, barrow was the first example I ever used on this channel for Proto-Germanic to English. However, that's not the only word for a mountain. Mountain is from Latin mons, which is from Proto-Indo-European montis. The root men is generally associated with towering in any case. The Latin root certainly influenced the Celtic and probably the Germanic, so I'll just use montis directly. That would become Proto-Germanic manthir. We have the Ingbionic nasal spirant law, which removes this nth cluster and lengthens and nasalizes this vowel. Now, normally it would brighten to ash, but it can't when nasal like we see in goose. However, it still can be umlauted like we see in geese, so we would expect meath. But if tooth, teeth, and goose geese had enough influence, it could be reanalyzed as an A stem and become mooth meath. Do you guys like it when I explain the sound changes in more detail? Proto-European laup is what gives us leaf, and it's cognate with some other things. However, both foliage and phelon are from Proto-European polium. Now, this root is what gives us bloom in English, but the specific stem of the root would result in balion. With umlaut and West Germanic gemination, we get bell, especially by analogy to bellflower, which I guess would be bell bloom in this alternate English. Blood in English is related to ball, balloon, and blow in the sense of some sort of swelling, but it had two different Proto-European roots. Incidentally, both of these made it to English. Blood outside of the body became raw, and blood inside of the body became iron. However, iron is A, pretty heavily derived and extended, and B, also received via Celtic. The pure unadulterated cognate would be esser. Now, most languages are not pure unadulterated, most notably Latin. The exact cognate to sanguis would be sunguis, a form we touched on plenty in eel and snake, so sing. The cognate to iron, without the unnecessary step through Celtic, is esurna, which, like iron, metastasizes to azron and probably ends up as oren. Now, we did this last time, so we'll need to do some quick rounds. Feather is accurate, fish is accurate, and cognate with Pisces. Smear is from the Proto-Indo-European word for grease or fat. Queen is from the Proto-Indo-European for woman. Foot and feet are both accurate with the umlaut plural. Breast as sten has reflexes in a surprising amount of languages. The Proto-Germanic reflex is speno, which gives the very dialectical speen. By contrast, Latin pectoral has pretty much only one cognate in Celtic. The unextended peg is more common, but also has broader meaning, so I'll just adapt the Latin. Even with Grimm's law changing g to k, these two letters don't play nice, compare seek sought, and no matter what the ending is, it breaks in palatal umlauts to fight. If it's an O grade, it can end up as fought, or fight if the ending umlauts it. This may be shocking, but wife is the feminine form of husband. This made it to Proto-Germanic as fadij, which is weird because the stress is supposed to be here and we would expect fathij, but you don't always get what you want. So, by analogy, the feminine form would be fadni, which would arrive in Old English as fade and fadne respectively, along with a bunch of other words that reinforce n as a feminine suffix. These both umlaut, twice in fact, and end up as feed and feeden. The word for earth can't just have normal cognates, instead it has chthonic and hummus. If we instead take the regular form that shows up in every language family except for these three that show up in English, we get Proto-Germanic dego. In theory, that would be Old English dega into d, but there's no way that happens. Why? Analogy to dig. The phonological conditions for ending a word in g is very unclear. There are three main possibilities. 1, be from Norman. 2, be from Norse. And 3, have a very confusing and unclear history involving geminates and velars of indeterminate voicing. For this particular problem, something like tekyom into digio into dija into dig is just on the edge of plausibility. I normally wouldn't say something like this, but honestly, I think it's just crazy enough to work. Fire is from one of two roots that meant fire, and even the one that made it to English is pretty irregular. Now, the idea that fowur contracted to fur is not at all unlikely, or even that just the O portion becomes oo and the oo disappears, but then that's influenced heavily by the oblique stem and ends up umlauting to fyr, and now we have fire. Focusing solely on the regular vanilla nominative, we would get fower. That's a neuter campfire like in Purge or Pyros. The masculine wildfire is what gives us ignite, agni, and agon, and it's a bit more complicated. Most conservatively, this becomes umpnij in Proto-Germanic, and one umlaut later we have inken in English. But it's unlikely to stay this way given that one of the ends dropped off in all the other languages. But I have an alternative. We can insert this labelization as an extra u. Now this vowel is the one that umlauts, and we get the more reasonable unken. What about unchen? Well, this is pretty clearly by analogy to sunken, so I'll keep it hard. So, unken. The Proto-European word for meat or flesh, in addition to the aforementioned raw, which also means blood, is mims. This is most apparent in Balto-Slavic languages, and membrane is also a distant relative. The Proto-Germanic form is mimja, which died out in Gothic. I'm a bit surprised we didn't get mimja, but I'm sure that happens later like sand. My best guess is minor, maybe lengthened by analogy to some verbs. River is the same root for aqua in Latin. Apparently, English was pretty similar to French even before the Norman invasion because we had the exact same idea for what to do with it. The river in Lincolnshire is pronounced U, though, and a more standard pronunciation would just be E. I have no idea how you would spell that. English doesn't like content words that are less than 3 letters. Maybe I or I? That's probably it. The Sanskrit word for your hair bristling, the Irish word for beard, and the ancient Greek dialectical word for a wreath are the only evidence we have for a Proto-European word that meant hair. This really only showed up in compounds, and most modern words for hair are descended from curly, so I won't spend too much time. It's not all that interesting to say pulvos, fulwaj, fulu, full, especially when it's so poorly attested. There are two competing but somewhat rare forms of nek. Krihwe appears only in Albanian, Slavic, and Sanskrit, while monis appears in Celtic, Latin, and Sanskrit, and notably Germanic. The word mean referred to a necklace and never made it past Middle English, but it would still give English mine. By contrast, the other one is more involved. In somewhat dubious theory, gua becomes ba in Proto-Germanic. Now this is post-Grimm's law, but I still think the could affect things. With that in mind, I think kriwo and priwo are equally likely, maybe even leaning towards the labial, then that breaks and lowers the same way glee did, and we get pre. I'm not attempting to pronounce this word because screw you guys, but it means hand. Unsurprisingly, that's gesor in Proto-Germanic. Now, there aren't actually a lot of RN stems other than fire and water, both of which are defined by a collective rather than a dual, like hand. So I propose a radical reanalysis by analogy to suesor, which became sister, that being gester. This becomes yester, perhaps even yester, but with yesterday by analogy, I think it's gotta be yester. There are two words for skin. One gives English fell, film, and leather via Celtic. The other gives sky, hut, and hide, both definitions. So take your pick. Heart is accurate, so is horn. There are two different words for head, one of which ends up as head, and the other indirectly gives gable. Directly, it would give gavel or maybe even yevel. Children is related to kin and very much Kinder in German. This is from a Proto-Germanic Kindtha, which hardened to kind and would become kind in English. This exact construction would end up as Kinamo, although name is indicative of what I said earlier about an stem, so Kinamo. Possibly Kinmo. I am a little uncertain about voice laryngeals here. Either way, I like the idea of it shortening to one harmonized syllable, which then becomes English chim. Apparent cognates to liver can be found all across the Indo-European family, but the original construction is hard to piece together and was probably irregular. The naive approach would be Yahur in Germanic, or Yehur, or maybe even Ihur. If the oblique stem gets adapted, something like Yachnij or Yachnaj are likely, and anything in between. And all that's assuming the first syllable is stressed to avoid Werner's law. Now, this doesn't really matter, because these all merge in Middle English and leave the non-active version as year and the oblique forms as yin. I think I'll stick with year, and yes, we're only halfway through the Swadesh list. I might not want to oversaturate my channel content, but screw it, I'll give you what you want. 1,000 likes for part 2.